So, Peter, your piece in many respects is, asking folks to contemplate what happens at midnight before 11:55, I guess, in the evening, to contemplate the idea that Bernie Sanders may very well win. That in the event that he does, and I think it's important to examine this, because I think there is a real sense. And let's just stipulate for a moment that I don't know if Bernie Sanders is a socialist in the context of the world, but certainly in the context of the United States, he represents a social democracy that is as left as we've seen in the United States, at the very least, since FDR, maybe even more so. But nevertheless, the point being, there is this sense, I think, amongst some of his supporters, and probably a sense under some of his, some of his detractors, that as soon as he gets in, he's going to be able to fundamentally change the country.
Yeah.
And the reality is that if he's elected, he is just the president, and he is dealing with, if he is lucky, a Congress that is run by Democrats in both houses. If he is unlucky, maybe only one house will be Democratic, the other will be Republican. I guess we could, in terms of political fortunes, we could argue as to which is luckier than the other. But there's certainly going to be resistance. In fact, I would imagine the resistance is going to be significant. What in your piece looks at and asks readers to look at how to make any change that a Bernie Sanders would bring to this country more durable and actually be executed. Where do you start with that? With answering that question?
Well, that's a really, really good question, Sam. And I think that there definitely needs to be reckoning with supporters of any progressive presidential candidate who wins. And it might be Bernie Sanders this year, it might be someone else another year. But that once genuinely progressive or social democratic or socialist candidate wins high office, there's going to be fierce backlash, not just from the Republican Party, but from huge parts of the Democratic Party. And there are things that we can probably start doing right away with presidential appointments. I think there's a good chance that a cabinet and some federal officials will be able to be appointed who can start working away at reversing the rollback to the Trump administration and some of the things that we can do within the existing legislation. But ultimately, if we want to start passing new laws, things like Medicare for all, free college, or like some of the more ambitious stuff around worker ownership that I talk about in the piece, then ultimately the president is going to have to think about how to fundamentally sort of reorient the balance of power within American politics, not just winning the top office, but how to also get control of the party in Congress, how to make sure that there's a durable, lasting majority. And I think that has to involve seeing yourself not necessarily as a uniter within the party, but potentially someone who says to certain folks, the Joe Manchins or of the world, that maybe this is no longer the party for you anymore, and encouraging primary challenges, using that platform at the top of the country to say that, look, I've been elected on this agenda, and if you're not going to cooperate in it, then I want my supporters to get rid of you. I think that, so there's going to be that political challenge, but then there's also going to be an economic challenge if you start getting into the really ambitious social democratic or socialist economic policies, which is that not only do you have politicians opposing you, but you also have business who are going to, in many cases, do whatever they can to undermine and destroy the fortunes of socialists or social democrats in your country. Now, that's going to require a very strategic approach, which may involve some policies that people aren't even thinking about at the moment. Stuff. How do we replace the private investment function with more socially oriented things? And
before we get into what those plans are, because I think this is something that I'm quite convinced very few people are thinking about, right? Which is and first off, before we even get to sort of that modality of thought that has to take place on how you set up the table essentially, so that people can start to eat is more or less is what we're talking about, is the implications of a Bernie Sanders being elected and not being able to execute upon a vast majority of his agenda. People should contemplate this as to how problematic. I mean, look, there's every reason. I happen to believe that we have some fundamental problems in the country that that Donald Trump's election is not the cause of, but is indicative of.
Absolutely.
And there's no reason to believe that these problems are going to go away unless there is people are offered and experience a change within the context of society that provides a certain amount of power and both of persuasion and of just sort of like a political power in the country. And the idea of Bernie Sanders getting elected and on an agenda of promising these things and being unable to deliver on them is, in many respects, more devastating than Bernie Sanders or someone, we could substitute various people in terms of, these progressive policies, and someone coming in and promising these progressive policies and being unable to deliver is almost more problematic than them not getting in the first place. It seems to me, in terms of like where we would be 4 years out or 8 years out. And that's what makes this question so incredibly crucial. How and it's centered around the difficulty that a Bernie Sanders, an Elizabeth Warren, let's say, I mean, people who are specifically in opposition to not just Trumpism, not just Trump, not just Trumpism, but the power of money in this country. They face a unique set of difficulty that might go beyond, a less ambitious program.
Definitely. And I think what we really need to start saying more among ourselves and in public is that really electing a social democratic or socialist candidate to the presidency is not is not when we win. It's the beginning of ultimately much longer and much harder fight, which is how to actually sort of carry out the agenda of a deep structural institutional change in wealth and power in our society that will make it just as hard for anyone else to reverse it, because we've had decades and decades of both Republican and Democratic administrations who have transferred not just wealth but also power and vetoes to the wealthy and powerful. And that's left us with first of all, like a very hollowed out labor movement, a hollowed out set of social movements that we've started to see some bounce back in with the sort of with the rise of the progressive left. But we do need to realize that when anyone takes executive office, that they're going to need a whole lot of pressure from the outside to keep them on the right course, to pressure people into cooperating with their agenda, and to make sure that those who are blocking it are the ones who are blamed for blocking it rather than the people who are trying to do it.
So, Peter,
ultimately, I think that what we need to do is not be Obama. We need to not get into office, try to unite the country, and let ourselves be blamed for not getting our agenda through. We need to actually make it clear that the people who are voting against our agenda are the ones responsible for it not happening.
All right, Peter, we got to take a break. And the only analogy I'll give, and when we come back, we'll talk about that, is that when you sit down, if you're a carpenter, you sit down to make a cabinet, one of the first things you do is you start to build jigs, and you start to build the tools that are going to help you actually build that cabinet. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about those tools that must be built before what the tools are supposed to build is built itself. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio.